The New Orleans Saints once again moving ahead with Andy Dalton out of the bye week at quarterback. More on the thought process behind the decision, what it means the New Orleans Saints will need to do well, and what it means for Jameis Winston. We got all of that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Saints, your daily podcast covering your favorite team, the New Orleans Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks so much as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget we're free and available on all podcast apps and on YouTube as well. And I'm your host, Ross Jackson, at Ross Jackson Nola on Twitter, your New Orleans Saints expert, credential member of the media, CrescentCitySports.com, USA Today Saints Wire, Tuesdays on Locked On NFL, and here with you every single Monday through Friday and then some on Locked On Saints. Today's episode brought to you by Prize Picks. It is daily fantasy made the way that it should be. Pick 2 to 5 players, choose whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than their Prize Picks projection. You get up to 10 times your entry. First-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 by using the promo code LOCKEDON at prizepicks.com. I'll tell you more about them later. But here on today's episode, we're blending the lines a little bit because usually we've been doing kind of the morning episodes as the present, the evening episodes as the future, but this one's going to walk the line a little bit because Dennis Allen announcing earlier that the New Orleans Saints are indeed moving ahead with Andy Dalton as their starting quarterback this weekend against the Atlanta Falcons. I'll tell you what went into that decision, what it means the New Orleans Saints are going to have to be better at, and what it means for Jameis Winston, New Orleans Saints quarterback, who was originally the starter at the beginning of the season. What does his future now look like with this team? We'll also break down, as promised, the 3 players that you need to see more of over the course of these past 4 games or upcoming 4 games, sort of blending into the future now in terms of just like what it means for 2023. So we're going to break all that down on today's episode. But let's start off with the news here, right? This is news, although not developing, just kind of the New Orleans Saints maintaining their status quo. We know how well that's worked for them so far this season. They're moving ahead with Andy Dalton as their starting quarterback. And it was one of those things that like, no one really even thought that this was honestly under consideration, that they would do anything else or they would do anything otherwise. It was a bit of a curiosity because, again, the only quarterback you have under contract in 2023 is Jameis Winston. So the Saints not making the decision to get a look at Jameis Winston and get him evaluated. Instead, they're moving ahead with Andy Dalton. And I'm going to be honest, I don't like the choice. I didn't like the choice of starting Andy Dalton in the first place outside of when we learned more and more about the injury. But I mean, even at this point here in the season, Andy Dalton's not on your roster next year. It's time to start looking at the guys that are on your roster next year and start to make some contract decisions. Now, this tells you that the New Orleans Saints may be looking at bringing Andy Dalton back over the course of this offseason, at least as a veteran backup again. But it tells you a couple of other things too. If you listen to the reasoning of why it is that the New Orleans Saints are moving ahead with Andy Dalton, is that they clearly still don't believe that the issues they've had over on the offensive side are in any way connected to the quarterback. It doesn't mean he has nothing to do with the fact that they've been averaging about 13 points per game here as of late. It has nothing to do with the fact that they have been dreadful on third down, dreadful in the red zone. Apparently, it's everyone else. It's everyone else over on the offensive side. And that was one of the things that Dennis Allen kind of highlighted. I'm being facetious when I talk about it. I'm making it sound worse than it really is. I know I'm having a little bit of fun here. This is, a podcast. It's fun. Like, we can have a good time here. But the other piece of it is Dennis Allen truly, believes that, or at least is telling us that he believes that the Saints offense could be doing better elsewhere. And one of the things that he was asked about was utilizing Alvin Kamara. And one of the things that he mentioned there was how they have to, get the ball to him in positions to allow him to be the playmaker that he's been for them in the past. And well, yeah, you're running out of options here, or you're running out of time to do anything else at this point, right? If the situation here is that the offense isn't performing up to snuff and you feel like the problem is elsewhere, but at quarterback, then there are a lot of things that have to change about this New Orleans Saints offense. I think the play calling has to change, the personnel selections, taking all 3 of your top receivers off at a pivotal point in the football game, probably not great, right? Probably not great. So you want to see this team start converting on third downs. You want to see this team start utilizing their playmakers a bit more. You want to see this team doing the things that work, like leaning on Taysom Hill and his expansive role, all of those things. But until you do all of that, it can't really be just about the execution of elsewhere on the offense. Like, it's got to come down to coaching. It's got to come down to the play calling. And one of the things Dennis Allen said was that it's on the coaching to put the players in positions that they need to succeed. So I'm not saying anything here that Dennis Allen and the New Orleans Saints coaching staff themselves haven't also articulated or haven't also kind of held themselves accountable for, right? So it's just interesting to me that like for this long, it's been not about the quarterback, not about the quarterback, not about the quarterback and elsewhere, but then there's really not been any adjustments in terms of how this team has approached the offensive side. And that's one of the things that I thought maybe over the course of these last 4 games, you might see a different play caller or at least a different play calling style, more aggression in play calling, because the conservative nature of this New Orleans Saints team has bitten them in the butt a ton of times. This isn't a team that's getting blown out all the time. This is a team that's losing close games. So they're not being aggressive and they're allowing themselves to be beat, despite the fact that I think Dennis Allen observed that going into last week's game, they were 9th in point differential. Like it's not that bad for them in terms of the season-wide outlook, but the record is still 4-9, and it will be the worst finish for the New Orleans Saints in over a decade and a half. So with that, something's got to give here. And I'm not surprised. People ask me like, what do you think about, Andy Dalton getting the start week 15? I'm honestly not surprised. I don't know why I would have ever expected this organization to do anything other than what they've done all season so far, which is stick with the status quo, stick with the status quo, stick with the status quo, grind it out, try to get better. The issue is that I don't believe that they can grind it out and get better at this point. Like we haven't seen that. So for me, it was all about like, well, here's what I would do, which is at least over the course of the last 4 games or some portion of the last 4 games, get a look at Jameis Winston and see what else you can give the offense. Like at least go out there and be a fun football team for the last 4 games, which is like so much a me as a spectator, right, take than it is an understanding football take, right? But understanding football, I also understand this team's not in the postseason this year. So, I mean, unless the Buccaneers lose out, unless the Atlanta Falcons and the Carolina Panthers lose every game but one, and the entire division basically finishes 6-11, and the Saints finish winning out, they're not going to the playoffs. They're not winning the division this year. And so I can't see where it is that this New Orleans Saints team continues to say, okay, well, the status quo is fine. It's working. We're just gonna keep doing what we're doing because what you're doing hasn't been working. So I thought maybe you might see some type of a change, but I didn't have an expectation for it. Hence why I'm not surprised by this decision. But what does this mean for Jameis Winston, though, moving ahead? I mean, we've discussed this kind of before. It's where we might have seen Jameis Winston already take his last snap as a New Orleans Saint. Now, they didn't close a door on, getting a look and evaluating Jameis Winston toward the end of the season. That could still happen, right? The Saints could do 2 more games of Dalton, 2 more games of Winston. And, they as an NFL team and as an NFL franchise with a ton of experience in this have what they need in terms of evaluating their decisions over the course of the offseason. But at some point, we just kind of have to admit here that there is a chance that the relationship is fractured, and that with there being an out in the contract at the end of this year, that the two could very likely sever and part ways over the course of the offseason. I mean, $11.5 million of dead cap for the New Orleans Saints. That's a drop in the bucket compared to where they are, their salary cap issues anyway. And so, or not issues, but situation anyway. And so at this point, when you kind of project the end of this season, we could also be projecting the end of Jameis Winston's time in New Orleans. And honestly, that's upsetting. But it's clear Jameis Winston was not the future of this franchise. It's clear Andy Dalton's not the future of this franchise. So they still have a quarterback problem 2023, 2024, no matter what. Like at some point, they still have to address the quarterback spot. Like they were never going to be in a position here to where they were going to come out of 2023 and say, okay, now we're good for the next 10 years. Know exactly what we're doing. Like that's not going to be the case for these New Orleans Saints. They still kind of have to figure all of that out. But it's just going to be interesting to see what all evaluations they take into consideration for what the future of this team looks like, particularly at that position. That's what we're going to get to. Actually, coming up next is evaluating the roster. There were 3 New Orleans Saints who stand to gain a lot over the course of the last 4 games of the season. And Jameis Winston's absolutely one of them. He's where we'll get started. We might not see him week 15, but if we saw him week 17 and 18, it could make all the difference for what his future looks like and where his future plays out. We'll break that down as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by Turo, Turo, the world's largest car sharing marketplace that you're going to find. Turo is an easy way for you to be able to book the car that you want wherever you want it from a widespreading community of local hosts. You're going to be able to browse a huge selection of whatever vehicle that you're looking for any occasion or any budget, not only in the US, but also in the UK, Canada, and Australia as well. So you need a spacious SUV or a family van, minivan for a family vacation, something like that, they got you covered. You want to test drive that new electric vehicle to see if it fits your everyday lifestyle, or maybe you just want an economy car on a budget. You just need to get from point A to point B. They've got that for you as well as luxury cars if you're trying to live it up a little bit. So many Turo hosts even will bring the vehicle directly to you as well. So you don't have to deal with the lines. You can get exactly the car that you're looking for. You're getting it from shared hosts, all this other stuff. It's super, super cool. Go and check it out. Cannot recommend it enough. Every trip is also backed by liability insurance. That's good news. Terms, conditions, and exclusions apply. Forget about those boring rental cars. Find your drive at Turo.com. Today's episode also brought to you by Audible. Audible is releasing a slate of new football podcasts that you are sure to love. We're so sure of it that's why you can actually find a sneak peek of Think Like a Champion, for instance, available right now as a bonus episode over at Locked On Presents. Think Like a Champion is a new podcast from Russell Wilson and Audible. Russell and his co-host end up digging into how high-performance athletes, artists, and leaders all push past the boundaries of potential and push those boundaries of potential each time. You think about Super Bowl champion and MVP Von Miller is there talking about the sharp insights into performing at your highest level in moments that demand the most extreme pressure. NCAA champion Tim Tebow also discusses how to find a unique personal mission in this world. They go through a whole bunch of stuff, including swapping stories, as well as some of the proven mental techniques that they utilize to make sure that they have become some of the most elite performers across the finish line and beyond. You can head over to Locked On Presents right now to get a sneak peek of Think Like a Champion, or catch the full series available wherever you get your podcasts right now, available everywhere now. Audible, get in the game. All right, family, continuing on with today's episode of Locked On Saints. Jameis Winston's time in New Orleans could be coming to a close, with New Orleans Saints still have something to benefit if they decide that they want to try to evaluate him before the end of the season. And it's not just about Jameis Winston on the offensive side. Trevor Penning, the New Orleans Saints first-round rookie, should be seeing some more snaps here toward the end of the season as well, with 4 games remaining. We're breaking all of that down as we look at 2 of the 3 players that I think have the most to gain in the last 4 games of this season. As always, we appreciate you so much for making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On Sports today as well, breaking down everything you need to know around the world of sports in 20 to 25 minutes, giving you everything you need from the angles that only Locked On can provide. Find it on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. All right, so Jameis Winston, Trevor Penning, 2 of the New Orleans Saints that I believe should be seeing snaps near the end or here at the end of this 2022 NFL season to help evaluate going into 2023. We'll start with Jameis Winston, always starting with the quarterback here. We know that we're not going to see him week 15. The Saints are never going to rule out seeing him at some point this season. There is a chance that they give him opportunities week 17 in Philadelphia, week 18 at home against Carolina. We'll see. But why would you, right? Like, what's the purpose, Ross? Why would you take a look at? Well, again, and I've said this over and over and over again over the course of the past few episodes, so forgive me for beating a dead horse here, but it is important. Jameis Winston is the only quarterback that's under contract in 2023. $5 to anybody who was able to say that word for word with me as I said it without being prepped. That would be awesome of you. You got to get this figured out, right? You have no quarterback future. You have no quarterback of the future on your roster right now. You don't have a future at the position right now, and it's the most important position on the field. It baffles me that this team does not seem to have a plan at this position at all, unless their plan is to play out the rest of the season with Andy Dalton and then bring him back in 2023. I mean, maybe you do that. You bring in a different offensive coordinator, you roll the dice, you would potentially profit, but I don't know, man. Like, is that really the most advantageous route to go when Tom Brady could potentially be out in Tampa? Carolina's still a mess. They have a whole new regime to bring in and install. We still don't know anything about the Atlanta Falcons. Like, the division could be within your grasp next year. And that doesn't mean that it's because Jameis Winston could be your quarterback. Like, just simply the division could be worse next year than it is this year. And it's terrible this year. And so just having some kind of clear plan at quarterback would make all the difference for this team. So getting a look at Jameis Winston to find out if you have that plan already on the roster in 2023 is probably a good idea. And then if you don't, then sure, you bring back Andy Dalton if you're sticking with Dennis Allen at head coach, or you try to go after another quarterback, or you go to the draft or whatever. But you might as well figure out, like, do you have the guy for 2023 on your roster right now? And so I think getting a look at Jameis Winston and finding out if you can get him back to the one quarter of good football that we were able to see from him with injuries and all those other things, that would make a big difference for you in terms of just understanding where you are at that position, the most important position on the field going into next season. It doesn't mean that Jameis Winston comes in and answers all of your questions or anything like that. There's still a chance that you go out there, Jameis Winston goes, he balls out for two games, and the team and the players still part ways over the course of the offseason. That's absolutely still possible. But hey, at least you have an idea of like what offense works, what offense doesn't. If there's a noticeable improvement in the offense at that time, or if there's a notable decline in the offense at that time. I don't know how the offense declines any more than where it is right now, but you might as well figure it out. And so while I understand the premise that it's really what's going on around the quarterback that has been an issue, I think it's both. And I don't think that that's unfair to say. So if you get a look at Jameis Winston, at least you get to figure something out in terms of what it could tell you for this team and where you're at that position going into 2023. Again, not answering all the questions, but at least gives you an idea of where you're headed. The next piece is Trevor Penning, who I mentioned. He was drafted in the first round. He was the guy that you gave up next year's first round pick effectively to get the second first round pick so that you could have him and Chris Olave, right? Those two guys. So it's not necessarily just that the Saints gave up a first round pick next year. They accelerated their first round pick for next year into this year. Turns out that pick is going to be a top 5 pick, unfortunately, to a team that looks like they could easily be the Super Bowl champions this year in the Philadelphia Eagles. You look now at Trevor Penning as the guy that makes that trade worth it or not worth it. And that's a lot of pressure on Trevor Penning, but it's not just down to Trevor Penning, right? It's Doug Marrone, it's Zach Strief, it's all of these other guys, it's the coaches, it's all that. So I think you kind of need to start figuring that out. And so I wouldn't be surprised to see Trevor Penning get 2 starts before the end of this season over James Hurst. I know James Hurst isn't hurt or he hasn't played terribly, anything like that. This is no shade at James Hurst at all. But I think you want to figure out what you have in Trevor Penning. And so you've kind of been bringing him in as the sixth man, the jumbo guy and all that. But I think give him a start or 2 at left tackle before the season's over, see where he is, go into the offseason with that additional piece of the evaluation. Do you become a better run team with him at the helm, even if you're still without Eric McCoy? Love to see Eric McCoy back, by the way, at some point this season too. But can you figure out or start to get the evidence that you need to be able to say, okay, this guy, the investment that we put in him, he is the future at left tackle. He's going to be ready to start week 1 because we got an opportunity to look at him at the end of the season, work with him over the offseason, and then bam, he's in week 1 in 2023. If they're able to do that, then you feel a little bit better about the trade. And, we kind of have to wait to see how the rest of it all plays out, right? Like the Saints trading their first round pick next year wasn't a bad idea until it became a bad idea, but you had to wait and get all the information that all of a sudden it was a top 5 selection. Now you kind of have to wait, see how do the Eagles, invest that top 5 selection. What does Trevor Penning turn into? Because if the Eagles blow it and they draft somebody in the top 5 that ends up being a bust and Trevor Penning ends up being a franchise left tackle, then I dare say the New Orleans Saints won that trade. So we have to wait and see how all that progresses. But for the Saints, getting a little bit of a look at him before the season is over, definitely not a bad idea. And honestly, if you want a little bit of juice injected in your offense, put the guy that's the fighter in and let him be the guy here at the end of 2022 as well. So I think getting the evaluation at Jameis Winston is very important. Getting the evaluation of Trevor Penning, very important. But it doesn't stop on the offensive side. There's one more player over on the defensive side and one more piece of evaluation. Honestly, it includes 2 players. But rookie Alontae Taylor is the guy that I'm thinking of. But also second-year corner Paulson Adebo across from him. Do you get Marshon Lattimore back? And if you do you start getting a look at Paulson Adebo and Marshon Lattimore versus Alontae Taylor and Marshon Lattimore so you know what your secondary looks like at the start of 2023? Not a bad idea. We'll break down how the New Orleans Saints can get that done as we continue on to wrap up today's episode of Locked On Saints. Before we get to that, today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Told you a little bit about them earlier. Let me tell you about them again, tell you a little bit more information about them. Basically, this is daily fantasy made the way that it should be. If you put all the smartest minds in the world together and said, come up with daily fantasy football, this is what they would have thought of. It's super simple. It's you versus the house. Your knowledge of your favorite players, your favorite teams, your favorite sport, your knowledge of the schemes, the matchups, all of those things versus the house. No, millions of, mystery lineups and trying to go for a, small pot of some, big chunk of money or anything like that. No. It's super simple. You put an entry down, you pick 2 to 5 players, you choose whether or not they're going to come in at more or less than what Prize Picks has them projected. And if you get those right, you can win up to 10 times your entry. And right now, first-time users can get a 100% instant deposit match of up to $100 by simply using the promo code LOCKEDON. You can use that over at prizepicks.com or by downloading the Prize Picks app today. Once again, it's promo code LOCKEDON, so you can get that 100% instant deposit match of up to $100. It's $100 that you deposit, and you get $100 on top of that. You deposit $50, you get $50 on top of that. Nice and easy. Go ahead and check them out. Promo code LOCKEDON over at prizepicks.com. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. Wrapping up today's episode of Locked On Saints with my third player that I feel has a ton to gain over the course of the last 4 games of this season. In particular, I'm highlighting Alontae Taylor because Alontae Taylor has the most to gain here, right? The evaluation, though, that needs to happen actually includes 2 or 3 players. If Marshon Lattimore, who's been dealing with that lacerated kidney issue, battling his way back from a very severe injury, which has kept him out since week 5 against the Seattle Seahawks, if they get him back, the Saints have a decision to make. Do they go with Paulson and Adebo opposite Marshon, or do they go with Alontae Taylor opposite Marshon? Based on the decisions that the New Orleans Saints have made so far this season, it seems likely that they go with the incumbent starter because status quo, don't want to rock the boat, all of those things. These sort of mantras that the New Orleans Saints have developed over the course of the season, that they would go with Paulson and Adebo. But I would not blame the Saints for looking at Paulson and Adebo opposite Marshon Lattimore for 2 games, and then looking at Alontae Taylor opposite Marshon Lattimore for the last 2 games. And that doesn't mean that Paulson and Adebo needs to be benched or anything like that. It's just go in with that plan and get a look to see which one of those pairings gives you the best possible outcome in terms of who your starting 2 could be at the beginning of 2023. You still have an offseason, OTAs, training camp to also continue to make that decision. Don't get me wrong. But while you have full game action to evaluate, much like I've discussed with Jameis Winston as well as Trevor Penning, you have a lot to stand to gain here in terms of getting a look at these 2 pairings of players. If you don't get Marshon Lattimore back, then still continuing to get those looks at Paulson and Adebo and Alontae Taylor has benefit, but Alontae Taylor has so much more to gain here. And the reason why I say that is not because I think Alontae Taylor is automatically the better player or that Paulson and Adebo is, somehow not the guy or whatever. It's not really about the evaluation of 2 players. It's just like, look at their standing. Paulson and Adebo's done this already. He came in, he was their starter his entire rookie year. He was their go-to starter going into this season. Alontae Taylor came in as kind of a special teams guy to start, and then they were going to get him work at corner, and now all of a sudden he could become the starting corner for an NFL franchise before his rookie season's out. So he's got a lot more to gain here because Paulson Adebo's already here. He's already the starter. He's the one that you have to beat if you're Alontae Taylor. So you have to go out there and compete and show that you deserve that starting role instead. And I know that a lot of people have also said, well, why don't you just put Alontae Taylor in the slot? That might be something that you work with him over the offseason and kind of try to develop that in him. But the guy's played like 40 slot snaps in his entire career, including college. So you don't just come out and throw him in the slot and say, yay, we have 3 good cornerbacks. No, that's not how the game works, right? Like that's an entirely different position that requires an entirely different skill set. One that I think Alontae Taylor has the traits for. His speed is ridiculous. His short area quickness is good. He moves really fluidly. He's able to, switch his hips and get everything, like I said, short area quickness is good. Good change of direction. Very physical. He has the traits, but can he put it all together to succeed there? We don't know yet, and probably not the time to figure that part out right now, especially when you don't know yet who's going to be your starter opposite Marshon Lattimore when he's healthy and when you get him back, and what your 2023 season is going to look like with a healthy Marshon Lattimore and either Paulson, Adebo, or Alontae Taylor. So if you get Marshon back, great opportunity to get a look at a couple of games with him and Paulson, get a look at a couple of games of him and Alontae. And then if you don't get him back, then the 2 guys just continue doing what they're doing. Paulson starting on one side, Alontae starting on the other side. And then they just continue to build up tape and continue to take steps forward and continue to improve. We've seen Paulson, Adebo improve throughout the season because of getting healthier. Struggled, well, I don't think he struggled all that much actually against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but the 41-yard pass interference penalty is a hard one to forgive. Alontae Taylor also had, a couple of penalties, or has had a couple of penalties with his physical play as well. But I don't think you try to remove that from either one of these guys' games. Like, you just kind of have to live or die with that. Like, you have to understand that maybe the defensive coverage should have been different so that he's not one-on-one over the top with with Mike Evans, and that instead you have some safety help back there, so on and so forth. Like, there's a lot of other ways to kind of address that, right? You can kind of take the same approach there as you took with Andy Dalton, and you say, well, it's not really him that we're concerned about. It's what was the defense doing around him, and you can look at everything. So you can apply that logic elsewhere. But for Alontae Taylor, man, he sure does stand a lot to gain. Because there were a lot of people that never expected him to be a starter. Period. Not just never expected him to be a starter his rookie season. People didn't expect Alontae Taylor to be a starter at corner. I thought they were going to move him to safety, remember? And there were a lot of other folks that were like, oh, well, it's just a blown pick. They just wasted a selection in the second round and all this other stuff. I understood why the Saints selected him. They really liked him. They didn't have a third or a fourth. You're not going to get him in the fifth, so you might as well just take him in the second. Go grab him if you like him. Jaquan Brisker's off the board. Go grab the next guy. Like, it makes perfect sense. But for me, like, looking at that, now, if you're Alontae Taylor, you're like, oh, okay. So I went from not being able to be a starter in a lot of people's eyes, especially at corner, to now being potentially the guy. Like, he could solidify that and win it. We could be looking at week 1 next season, going back to week 17 and 18 this season and saying those are the moments where you knew Alontae Taylor was going to be the new starting cornerback opposite Marshon Lattimore. So huge opportunity for Alontae Taylor over the course of these last 4 games. And then potentially, if Marshon Lattimore comes back, hopefully some other portion of games, some split of games. We've seen the Saints do this all season, by the way. They've rotated who's in on what drives at corner and everything like that. Like, it would not be out of the ordinary to see them try to get as much evaluation of these players as possible, even if it means splitting up the reps or splitting up the games opposite Marshon. So it's going to be interesting. Going to be a fun one to watch. But I think he has so much to gain. So him, Jameis Winston, if we ever see him again, and Trevor Penning are all the guys that really stand a lot to gain. But it looks like New Orleans Saints moving forward with Andy Dalton, at least out of the bye week. So we might not see Jameis Winston, but we still get to see some of the stuff from over the defensive side. And of course, hopefully, potentially see some starts for Trevor Penning down the stretch here as well. So those are the guys that we're going to be watching as we continue forward. On tomorrow's episode, we're going to start looking ahead to the Atlanta Falcons. You've got Andy Dalton, you've got Desmond Ridder. You know what the quarterback matchup is, but what are some of the other big key matchups that we're going to be watching? We're going to break that down as a part of our present series on Tuesday, and then we'll get to our future series in the evening. Appreciate you, as always, making Locked On Saints your first listen of the day every day. Don't forget to also go and check out Locked On Sports Today as your second listen today, which will give you everything you need to know around the world of sports. About 20-25 minutes. You can find it on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. As always, thank you so much for making me a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me and the show. And if you need any, or as always, if you see me, say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, there we go. I got it. I found it. Make sure you follow me on Twitter at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust you, that nation. I'll holla at you.